to India and Ireland, round Africa and back again. We don't really need to know just where we'll go. Maybe Canada, then to Brazil, then through the Alpine foothills. All I really want to know is, can we go? Oh baby, can we go? Round and around the globe.
Welcome to Take Me With You, episode 92. I'm Ryan,
And I'm Cheryl. We are two well-traveled people who want to go everywhere.
but that's not going to happen. So instead, we'll travel vicariously by inviting a guest to share their unique travel stories with us.
Today, we are back to our summer series.
Woohoo!
Yeah, so we took a couple weeks to talk about my trip, and now we are continuing for the rest of the summer to talk about travel shows.
Yes, we are. And I think we say this every week, Cheryl, but this is fun.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Although this week is a little different.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting in us choosing this show because when we first talked about this series, we looked
Yep.
at a ton of lists of travel
Yeah,
shows.
we did. Yep.
And also saw which ones can we actually find and be able to watch.
Right.
And I saw this show really early on in that search and read a brief description and saw just like the cover image of it on Netflix
Yeah.
and realized like we don't need to watch that because it's not for us. And then as we've been watching a variety of shows and learning that it's better if we're watching kind of a whole slew of
Yep.
types of travel shows, then this is the perfect thing for us to be watching because it's a type of travel that's not for us. But I think we should talk about it.
Well, I would even go so far as to say it's a type of travel that, based on its initial description, is not for us. But
Yes.
until you dive into it, like at least for me, there were some things that I didn't expect to see that changed my perspective a little bit. Yeah. I don't want to get
Yeah,
into all
I
of it right
think-
now, but
So we watched this show called Dark Tourism.
Dark Tourist, I think.
Dark Tourist. I keep thinking it's called Dark Tourism, but it's called
Well,
Dark
because
Tourist.
they talk about dark tourism, because it's about dark tourism. So maybe we
Yes.
should start by just describing what that means.
Yeah, so I didn't know.
No, I had
It's
not
a-
heard of it before.
It's a Netflix show, and just that
Yes.
image is what, a skull? I don't have it in front of me.
I think so. Yeah. And the idea, apparently this is not, Netflix didn't make this up, but dark tourism is an actual branch of tourism, just like ecotourism, or I don't know if it has its own name, but history and art tourism or whatever. But it's people who go to see sites or have experiences that you might consider on the darker side. They're
Yeah.
depressing, or they're scary, or they're, just the dark side of humanity types of things.
Yeah, so like really terrible things that happen in history, and
Yeah.
it can be pretty recent history,
Mm-hmm.
or even like present day, like sites of just really sad things going on. I would say sad things, but
I think sad
Yeah.
would fall in there too. I don't think they're all sad, at least not in the episodes that I watched. They weren't all
Yeah.
sad.
because I think that, like in a lot of shows, there's just going to be a ton of variety between the episodes,
Right.
which is why
Right.
we're covering 3 between
Yep.
the two of us so that we're not just watching one.
Yep.
But also,
And
we don't
this
have all
is
the
a
time
great-
in the world.
Well, yeah, there's that too. But I think this show is another really good example. We've had it happen before as we've been doing this, where I had two very different watching experiences for the two different episodes that I watched. One of them, I don't ever want to see again. And if that's what the whole show was, I was like, and I'm out. And the other one I actually kind of enjoyed.
Interesting.
Yes.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk about this. So one key thing that stood out to me overall in this show is that the host of the show is not a dark tourist.
Right. And that
And that was a
surprised me a little
surprise.
bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he's interested in finding out more about dark tourism and the people who are dark tourists.
Which is really interesting. that
yeah,
aspect
it's
of
the
it.
human side of that.
Yes. I think what makes it a little more boring, though, is also that he's not into it because he's pretty monotone and his narration can kind of like, I don't know, it felt like I wanted him to have more reactions to things. But he's a journalist, so I think like
Right.
he doesn't really show emotional reactions very much because I think he's taking it in intellectually,
Right.
which doesn't necessarily play like on his face or anything like that. And I was
Sure.
expecting kind of like an intense host with a show like this.
Right. Over dramatic type.
Yes.
And it really wasn't, which I appreciated.
Yeah. It
And
made
he's
me
from
not
New Zealand.
grossed out. I thought I was going to be like, couldn't even look at the screen with this show or something.
Well, that was one of the episodes I watched.
Okay. So I'm glad I didn't watch your episode.
Yeah.
So there's only one season, and this is, like we said, a Netflix show. There's 8 episodes. So it's one thing I kind of like about some of these series coming out these days is they're not forever long. So you just kind of get a taste of it. And the host is David Farrier, who is from New Zealand.
Which means he has an amazingly awesome accent.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that was a good aspect for sure.
Yep.
And we watched episodes 2, 3, and 4.
Sounds right.
Yeah.
So I think you watched episode 2.
Yes.
So do you want to start?
Sure. So I watched the episode titled Japan, and he goes to, it seems like probably in each episode he goes to a couple sites because this is like a 45-minute show. So there's time to go to a couple places. And so he goes to Fukushima, and he goes to a replica of a Dutch town. I didn't get the name of it.
I'm sorry, what?
It's
What do you mean he goes to the replica of a Dutch town in Japan?
Yes.
I'm confused, Cheryl.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see what's confusing. It's a replica of a 16th century Dutch town. Feel like that's pretty self-explanatory, but
Okay, sure.
if you need me to explain it a little bit more, I could.
I think that would be helpful.
And then he goes to the Jukai Forest, and then he finishes it with Hashina Island. So I guess it's kind of 4 places that he goes to in this episode. So Fukushima is where the earthquake and then tsunami and then explosion of the radioactive building or just radioactive center happened in 2011.
I don't believe it was an explosion. I could be wrong, but the nuclear reactor ended up. It wasn't a meltdown because it wasn't like Chernobyl, but it definitely did release. I think because of both the earthquake and then the tsunami, it overflowed whatever their storage facilities were and stuff, and it was like the perfect storm of all the wrong things that had to happen in order for it to have a runaway effect or whatever it was.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I wrote the word explosion, and now I'm not remembering if that was my word or his word.
Well, here, let's ask the internet.
Okay, that sounds good.
Here's what I have that I found on the World Nuclear Association website.
Oh, okay.
Following a major earthquake, a 15-meter tsunami disabled the power supply and cooling of 3 Fukushima Daiichi, I'm probably saying that word wrong, I apologize, reactors, causing the nuclear accident on the 11th of March, 2011. All 3 cores largely melted in the first 3 days. And I don't see anything about an actual explosion here. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. Oh no, there's definitely an explosion.
I think they showed video of it on this show.
Okay. Yeah. Although the explosion itself, from a nuclear reactor perspective, the explosion itself is not the super dangerous part. It's the radioactive fallout that's the dangerous part.
So that's what they talk about in this show, essentially.
Gotcha.
And so he is on this tour bus with a handful of other tourists who are interested in checking this out. And then a tour guide who is this very peppy positive person who's a local. And he shares, they each have what's it called? A Giga counter. Is that how you pronounce it?
Geiger count.
Geiger counter.
Geiger counter.
Geiger
Yeah.
counter.
Yeah.
Which measures the level of radioactivity in the area.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So we learn right away that the level where you would not want to live there is 0.2. And so all of these tourists kind of learn that for the first time, that you wouldn't want to live there if it's above 0.2.
You probably don't remember the units that they were using, do you? Rads or
No.
sieverts or no? Okay.
No, but you and I watched another episode where they talk about those levels again. And so
Yes,
I
we
got
did.
2 radioactive episodes.
Yes, you did.
today. And so it's funny because I think these tourists and he are learning about these levels and everything maybe for the first time.
Oh, probably. Yeah.
And then quickly their Geiger counters show 0.75. And so they're
Mhm.
already kind of a little spooked. Like,
Sure.
okay, people wouldn't want to live here. And so it's funny, though, because the tour guide says that the government says it's safe for residents to return, but they haven't returned. And they said, well, they asked him, well, if it's above 0.2 and the government says it's safe, like how could both happen? And he said the government declared it a state of emergency so that they could say that it's safe to return because they want people to return and live there again. So that was
Wait, what
kind
does
of...
that have to do with a state of emergency? I'm confused.
I have no idea. I don't understand
Okay.
enough about a state of emergency, but I think it was something where like maybe they're trying to say that there's an exception and they can declare it safe or something like that.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
and so
but
we
no one's
see, like,
returned.
No one's returned. So they're going to these abandoned towns that you can see were very quickly abandoned. And
Right.
he was surprised, like, no one's even come and looted or anything here.
Mhm.
It's just abandoned. It's so funny. They put masks on and he's annoyed because his glasses are fogging up. And in our present day COVID times that we live in,
Yeah,
that has
that
been
is the
a daily frustration of mine when I put my mask on and my glasses fog up. And so it was funny that to him that was a
That's
foreign
funny.
thing. And I was like, oh, that looks so normal to see people in
It
masks
does now
for
yeah.
us. Not when they
But
shot
it-
this show.
Exactly. It wouldn't have seemed normal to us 3 months ago.
Yeah. So that was kind of
Yeah.
funny.
Interesting.
And then eventually they go to another, I guess in maybe another town or something that even the government calls the difficult to return to zone.
Oh,
Which is
interesting.
obviously a translated term.
Right.
And it looks like a military zone kind of. And like they get in trouble for trespassing eventually. And this like government employee tells them to leave because it's a difficult to return to zone. Which
Oh,
is, I think,
interesting.
like the nice way of saying you're legally not allowed to be here because of how
Yeah.
dangerous it is.
Yeah.
But they do go to some other areas around there. And so, like, they go to a lunch at a cafe called Grandma's, and it's run by a bunch of grandmas.
Oh, fun.
But the government, like, put cafes like that there to try to entice people to, like, want to come back and
Oh,
visit there
interesting.
and live there again. And they also learn that everyone who works there, like, no one lives there, even the people that work there.
Sure.
The government has also hired street performers. So, like, there's someone doing, like, balloon art and makes him, like, a mermaid outfit, balloon art and things like that. So it was just very odd, like, that combination of things, you know, that
Yeah.
the government wants them to come back, but everyone is feeling like it's not really safe. And then they see where the tsunami hit. So they they go to the coast where the tsunami hit, and they see what used to be little towns, and it's just obviously piles of stuff.
Yeah.
And the different tourists are kind of having different reactions to that. So that's interesting because obviously all of them chose to go on this tour.
Mhm.
I don't think it was a surprise where they were going, but like these young Japanese guys were like taking photos and like kind of more like making fun of it or laughing about it a little bit. And then these other women from America were saying like that was really disrespectful and devastating and everything. So it's interesting that the people on this tour obviously had different reasons for wanting to go on this tour.
Yeah.
It was really creepy. The only thing heavy enough to stay in place where the tsunami hit were the gravestones. And so there's a graveyard that looked way more untouched than everything else, which is just absolutely obliterated. So that was kind of interesting. And then they visit these big green tarps, just massive, and they're all perfectly lined up in a row. And there's a above shot where there's just a ton of them, and all the tarps
just on the ground flat,
covering millions of bags of radioactive soil.
Oh, interesting.
And so you can see a couple of the bags sticking out. The bags were made to last for 3 years, and it's been 6, so they're starting to deteriorate, which is part of why in this show they're saying maybe that's part of why they covered it in the tarps too. And so they're all perfectly lined up, and there's a ton of them, and they're huge, these tarps. And they say there's 9 million bags of the soil. And so...
And did they talk about why they moved it to where they moved it?
Slightly. I think they just kind of talked about how they were trying to clean it up. And so I don't know if that's so that hopefully people can live where that soil used to be again. But I think that was their cleanup attempt. What a crazy thing to have to deal with, though. Wow. And then at this point, their Geiger counters are at 1.3. And it's so funny because people on the bus start panicking more. And I just keep thinking, well, why did you choose to go on this tour?
Well, and the other thing, too, and we can talk about this more during the episode we both watched, too. But one of the things that I think is confusing for people is what those numbers mean. Because that number, that 0.2, whatever the unit is, which I could figure out if I did a little bit more research which unit it is. It's probably sieverts, but I could be wrong on that one. Or millisieverts, actually, probably. But it has to do with sustained exposure. So it's not that if you have a 0.75, now all of a sudden you're going to be sick. It's if you have a 0.75 and you live there and you have it day in and day out, that's what leads to the issues. And so people who are freaking out about, it's above whatever you said, 1 something.
Yeah.
Right. But not having enough understanding of what those numbers actually mean, I could totally see why you would be worried and be afraid.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and part of it too is that each individual on this bus has one, and it beeps whenever it gets to like a higher amount. And so there's more and more beeping on this bus as it goes to 1.9, 2.3, 2.8, 7.19. And so the people on the bus kind of start panicking a little bit. And eventually they, as a group, decide like, okay, we want to be done and turn around, and we've gone far enough. So that's that tour. Again, though, I just feel like, well, then why did you come? But I don't know.
But I could see someone thinking, oh, it would be cool, and not realize how deep they were going to be, or not really having understanding of how radiation works, and not recognizing. Because one of the things about radiation, it actually reminds me a little bit about the whole COVID-19 thing, is you can't see it.
Yeah.
Right? It can be there, and you can be exposed to it and have no idea and no indication until quite a while after the actual exposure. Unless it's a super, super intense radiation, then you may get a radiation burn fairly quickly. But most circumstances, you're not going to be under that level of radiation exposure.
Yeah. And so that's really interesting for TV because then I think you have to kind of have the other visuals and sounds and storytelling to try to demonstrate. That's why this area that we're in is really weird. And so
which is probably why they give them all the Geiger counters.
Yeah, I think
to give them that tangible connection.
Yeah. So anyway, that was that part. And then they go to a post-apocalyptic themed hotel, which is supposed to be a future run by robots. So like there's velociraptor robots that are checking you in.
That are checking you in?
Yes, like at the counter, you check in with a velociraptor. And then
So there's not actually a person doing the check-in.
yeah. I mean, I
Interesting.
don't know if they just didn't show the people, because obviously there's still have to be some people there.
Somewhere, yeah, there would have to be.
And then in your hotel room, you get a personal robot. And it's funny
Oh.
because this robot is way dumber than like the Google Home device that I have. And so it was funny because he kept asking it if it could sing him a song. And then it was asking him what time he wanted his alarm for the morning. And he said, oh, okay, I guess 7 a.m. And then he asked him, but I didn't ask you that. I asked you to sing me a song. And then eventually he's asking him if he would like an alarm for 8:30 the next morning. And so that's so funny because then like
Oh, boy.
later the robot says, turn the lights off. And he says to it, was that a question or a statement? So then where that hotel is this replica of a 16th century Dutch town.
Oh, okay.
And it is like Leavenworth, but way more extravagant and
And
larger.
why is it there?
That, I mean, they don't say why. We don't really get
Okay.
into that.
Alrighty.
And this is funny because he says, you're probably wondering why everyone's wearing a mask. And then I immediately, because of COVID times and because of this show, I'm picturing over their mouths, but they're wearing like masquerade type masks.
Oh,
And
and
not
it was just over
everyone,
their
but-
eyes?
Yeah, just
Or-
over their eyes.
Okay.
And then he's on a carousel and they give him like a VR thing. And so he's on this old carousel, but it's supposed to be VR to show him like what it would look like. I
If
don't
he
know.
was
They cover
in
it super
Holland?
briefly and they don't give you an example of what he's seeing, but he's on a carousel
Oh.
alone with his like VR headset on.
Okay.
And there's just lights everywhere and lots of people dancing, and it was really beautiful, but it was so surprising. But it was
Huh.
a snippet of the episode, so they did not get into a lot of detail about
So
why or
The
anything.
dark component of this site was the hotel, it sounds like, not the town.
Yeah, or just maybe that it's weird or like
Okay.
unique,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
guessing.
Okay.
And then they go to the Jukai Forest. Have you heard of that?
No.
It's near Mount Fuji.
Okay.
It is a popular place to commit suicide.
Oh.
I'm not sure if you're aware very much, but suicide rates, especially of teenagers in Japan, is really, really high.
Yes.
And
yeah.
I had heard about that teenagers would go out to the forest and commit suicide. And this one is really popular for that. He talked about how it was popularized by a novel that came out in the 1960s called The Black Sea of Trees. So along with that, then of course there's lots of beliefs of like ghosts in this forest or just like
Sure.
weird spiritual forces. And so he
Mhm.
brings the tour guide back from the first part of the episode. And this tour guide talks to him about like before you walk in this forest and kind of gives him this like spiritual briefing before he goes in about you
Okay.
might feel these forces.
Okay.
And they also then they talk to a guy who's an expat and runs a local cafe, and he talks about how it's hard to tell sometimes, like, was it a suicide or was someone murdered? Because there's also thoughts of like you need to be really careful if you go into that forest that you don't get
Oh.
murdered, essentially, because people find
Okay.
dead bodies in there. And they find like a rope that was probably used as a noose on a tree. So yeah, that was just really sad. They don't make it gory or icky. It's just kind of a sad thing. And there's a sign outside the forest that says something like your life is something that you receive from your parents and you need to think about your parents and your siblings, and kind of like trying to remind people of the value of their lives. To me, it's really interesting just knowing a little bit about Japanese culture that would tell them that their life is important because of their family.
Because they're family.
Because I think there is a big tie to the importance of family. There's also a
Yeah.
lot of shame in Japanese culture, which is why the suicides are so high because
Hmm.
if you get poor grades or different things like that, it can be extremely shameful. And a
Right.
lot of Japanese people can feel like there's not really a way out of that. Um, and it was interesting too. They ran into some American tourists who were there to check it out, and so he's asking them like why they
Yeah.
cared about it. And so it was interesting because I think it was just kind of this like gross fascination, or almost, or I can't.
Hmm.
It was just really interesting because that's not how I think, and that's not why I'm interested in things myself. So it's hard to get in
Right.
that headspace. But that was interesting. And then they talked to a woman who went into the forest 30 years before to commit suicide and then chose not to because she said she saw a ghost that told her not to. Um, and
Okay.
she just really talked about feeling the spirituality there, and she could feel it on her
Mm.
neck, and she felt all these forces. And so the host was asking her like, well, am I safe? And she was like, oh, you're fine, it's just me. So it was
Hmm.
really interesting. But it was, I think, interesting for me to see because I've heard about this idea. It was interesting to
Yeah.
see that location and everything.
Hmm.
And I I think one thing about this show that I did appreciate is that I'm a very positive, optimistic person who doesn't
Hmm.
always like to think about the hard things or the sad
Yeah.
things, but I think that it
Yeah.
can be really important. And I think that aspects of this show that are just kind of showing like here's a sad reality that's also in present day
Yeah.
was, I think, kind of a good thing for me to think about sometimes because
Mm.
I don't naturally go there.
Yeah.
And then finally we went to Hashina Island, which I did not know about. It's near Nagasaki, and he called it the ultimate ghost town.
Oh.
And
Okay.
I thought it was going to be some because of bombing or some tsunami or creepy reason or something. But it's an island that used to be the most densely populated area on the planet.
Oh,
and
really?
It's not a big island. Like they showed an overview of it, and it's totally abandoned now. But it was on top of a coal mine. And so all these people lived there. I think because they worked in the coal mine.
Sure.
And then around 50 years ago, the mine became uneconomic, I think is what they said. And everyone
Okay.
left in the space of a week.
Oh my gosh.
And so, again, kind of like where this tsunami and earthquake have happened,
Hmm.
it's just abandoned. Like there's still stuff there. And it's just these buildings that are falling apart. And so they have a man come who lived there 50 years ago when he was a kid. And it seems like maybe hasn't been back there since. And so they go to where he lived, and they go up to the very top of this building, which is like a temple and has like a beautiful view over the ocean and the island. And you can see like just how densely populated it was because there's just these massive apartment buildings that are concrete, and you can see that they're just little units. Like he said, his family with like 2 parents and 4 siblings lived there, and he slept in the closet, and
Oh my
it's
gosh.
like not a big place. And he's just like, this is just all we knew, so this was normal to live
Yeah.
like this. But there were shops and sporting arenas and a pool and a school, so it was large enough to kind of be able to have a whole life on this little island with, I think they said like 3 million people. It was a lot of people.
Whoa.
I'm not remember the exact numbers. I didn't write that one down. But so that was really interesting. And again, like to me, that didn't feel icky dark. It just felt like an interesting piece of history that I've never
Yeah.
heard about.
Maybe a little eerie when you're in a place where it's totally empty.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I wrote down a quote from the end of this episode. He said, "It made me more happy to be alive. Maybe that's the point of dark tourism." Because it feels like in these episodes that I watched, he's trying to figure out why people are dark tourists.
Yep.
And so he kind of makes statements like this of like, how did it make him feel? And he's
Yeah.
speculating if that's why people would care about that type of tourism.
Yeah.
So that's the Japan episode.
All right. Well, would you say that that matches your experience of being in Japan?
No, not so much. Yeah. So I went to Japan in seventh grade, and I was there for a week and a half, and I got to stay with a local family.
Hmm.
I went with 10, there were 10 of us from my middle school and 3 teachers that went as like a short term exchange student program.
Mhm.
And so I definitely saw a, a bit of the denseness of the population, but I was outside of Kyoto, and so it was nothing like Tokyo or one of the areas where they're just like shoebox apartments.
Right.
And I did have some classes before I went about the culture, so I learned about these aspects of culture that kind of tied in to this episode, but this is nothing like what I saw, or nothing like the aspect of Japan that I saw.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So seventh grade Cheryl was not a dark tourist then?
Present day Cheryl is also not a dark tourist.
Wow, I had no idea. I was going to save that reveal for the end of the podcast.
So, Ryan, which episode did you watch?
Well, I watched the next episode, which was episode 3. It's one of, I believe, 2 episodes that take place somewhere in the United States.
And you have been to the United States,
I have been to the United States.
which
I
is
have
why
not.
we picked this episode for you.
It is because I've been struggling finding a place that I've been to, because I haven't actually been to any of these places in the United States that he's been. But I have been to the United States.
Yeah, it was the closest we could get. I mean, with only 8 episodes, that
Yeah.
was kind of the best we could do.
Yep. So in this episode, he goes to 3 different places. He goes to Milwaukee, Dallas, and then New Orleans.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want the dark tourism aspect of New Orleans so much.
You don't. You
Okay.
really don't, Cheryl.
Okay.
I'm just going to preface this right now. I really did not like this episode at
Yikes.
all.
Yikes.
This is what I pictured a dark tourism show to be. So remember how you were surprised that it wasn't what this one was?
Oh, icky. Okay,
Yeah,
can I
it was-
guess?
Yeah, please.
Okay, because I don't know what your episode was about.
Right.
Milwaukee, Dallas, and New Orleans. Actually, the only guess I have would be something about voodoo in New Orleans.
Sort of. It's connected to voodoo.
Okay.
But
Actually,
it's-
I don't think I even have a guess for the other places, because I just don't think about the dark
Nope.
aspects of a lot of places.
Nope. And I wouldn't have. So I will share, and I just apologize if anyone, I don't think I'm going to be particularly graphic. And nothing was really graphic or anything. It was just disturbing, I think is the word that I would use. So if you're the type of person that would rather not hear about those things, maybe skip ahead a little bit till the end. The Milwaukee part's kind of blech. The Dallas part is fine, and then the New Orleans part is blech again. So just
Okay.
heads up. So Milwaukee they were there to find out more about what they call the Cream City Cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer,
No,
serial
thank
killer.
you. I'd like to skip ahead as well. Oh.
Yeah, sorry, Cheryl, you don't get to do that. So, like in the episode that you had, he meets someone who is a dark tourist and who is there and is apparently, her name's Natalie. She's very fascinated by serial killers and specifically Jeffrey Dahmer. And they meet in this place called Shaker's Bar, which is apparently the hub of serial killer tours. Apparently that's a thing there. And so there's a bunch of people who come and want to go on these serial killer tours. Maybe it's like a Jack the Ripper type tour in London, because that's one that's fairly popular maybe. I think for me personally, just because Jack the Ripper feels very distant because it was from another time period, way back when.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel as real,
Yeah.
even though it was.
Yeah. I mean, murder podcasts are huge.
Oh yeah, true crime, all that
Yeah.
stuff for sure.
So
Absolutely.
I could see a market for that.
Yeah, and I don't think that necessarily because you're fascinated by it that in and of itself is bad or creepy. Just in and of itself. It's definitely not me, but I think it also depends on the level at which you're fascinated by it.
Yeah.
And some of these people are really, really into it. And so the tour, it's a nighttime tour, of course. And he describes it as being dominated by women in their 30s, and that there are a lot of bachelorette parties that go on this tour.
I could see that.
Okay.
Yeah. Like there's a podcast that's very popular called My Favorite Murder, and it's
Oh, I think I've
probably
heard of that,
two
yeah.
women in their 30s that have
Sure.
this podcast, and I think there is this weird fascination with it. Yeah.
Okay. They go around and they end up outside of Club 219, which is apparently where Dahmer picked up a lot of his victims. And then the tour guide takes out these dowsing rods. I don't know if you're familiar with what dowsing rods are.
No.
Think of thin metal rods that are kind of in an L shape, where you would hold on to the shorter part and then it kind of goes out in front of you,
Okay.
the metal. So like you're holding it in your hand and then it turns at 90 degrees and then points away from you.
Okay.
Does that make sense? And you put two in your hands. They do that for a lot of things. They when they talk about dowsing for water, if you're looking for water to dig a well, it's the same sort of a thing. And they didn't call them dowsing rods at the time, but I looked at them and was like, that sounds familiar. And I did a little research, and yes, what they were holding were dowsing rods. And so basically she's talking about talking to, now I don't remember and I didn't write it down. I think it's talking to Jeffrey Dahmer is supposedly what they're doing. And she asks like yes or no questions. And if he asks, cross the rods. And so then the rods will like move or not move. And it's this whole thing. And it was funny because
So it's like a Ouija board.
Kind of, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's totally bogus.
Yeah.
It has been disproven by all sorts of reputable scientific investigations all the time, but people still use it and believe it. Okay, fine. But what I appreciated was both the host and then Natalie, who he was traveling with, don't really believe it. And I don't remember which one. One of them says, I think it was Natalie. She says, I really have no patience for woo like that. So even someone who's fascinated with that particular, serial killers still wasn't into that kind of let's talk to spirits type of idea, which I thought was interesting.
Oh, I think that's very separate.
Oh, and it definitely is.
Yeah.
It definitely is. But I just think that that's interesting. And then they meet with Wendy, who was the lawyer who defended Dahmer in court. And they talked to her. And because since she was the defense attorney, she had lots of direct interactions with him. She had some recordings of interviews that she played for them. And she had a drawing that Dahmer had done of his shrine. And I'm not going to describe it any more than that.
Okay.
If you want to know more, you can watch the episode or the internet's out there. And I think that for me was the most disturbing part was because it was real, right?
Yeah.
And just hearing what he was like and the way he thought and the things that he did to his victims. And it was just very, very disturbing and bothersome. And they both walk out at the end, and David Farrier, the host, is kind of talking to Natalie, kind of interview style, like you said, a journalist. What did you think? Whatever. And she loved it. She was super fascinated by it. She found it incredibly interesting. And I was very disturbed. I was like, I don't need this in my life. I don't want any of this in my life. This is not something extra that I want.
You know, what's interesting is that there is a piece of true crime podcast that I like. And I think part of why I can sometimes be on board with them is because it's just the listening part without visuals. And I've realized, like, I don't think I would want to watch anything about this, but I think just hearing the story can be interesting to me. I've listened to a few of them, but I think
Yeah.
it would cross a line with having visuals as a part of
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And again, I think part of it too is it felt really real, and it was.
Yeah.
And that and it's not that I want to be in denial that those things exist, but I also, and this is just my own personal take on things in life in general, I don't, there's enough garbage and icky that comes into life that you can't avoid, that I don't really feel like I want to add that to my life,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily immediately fault someone else who does, or think that they're twisted or demented or anything like
Yeah.
that. I think that can happen, but I don't think that's automatic just because you're fascinated with true crime or something. I don't think it's this,
Yeah.
either or dichotomy. But for me personally, those are just not the sorts of things that I want more of in my life.
Yeah.
So
That makes sense.
yeah. Then we went to Dallas, and this was a
Okay.
very different experience and less creepy, just a little odd to me. And they went to Dallas because that's where JFK was assassinated.
Oh, okay.
And so, it's historic, but he does two different tours that are very different in style. And the first one is with an older gentleman named Robin, and he comes and picks him up in a recreation of the actual car that JFK and Jackie were riding in Dallas.
Oh,
So it looks like, the presidential car. It's a convertible. It has the flags on the front corners and things like that. And he starts talking and explaining things. And pretty quickly, it becomes apparent that he's totally a conspiracy theorist and believes all of these other things, which may or may not be true. I have no idea. I have not investigated it. I haven't looked into it. In general, if you're going to force me to make a decision, on something, I'm going to side on it's not a conspiracy, just because that's kind of my more conservative bent on things. But it's possible that it was more than just Lee Harvey Oswald. Is that the right one? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, Lee Harvey. Yeah, the assassin that got convicted and then killed or whatever. A lot of people think that there was somebody else and it wasn't just him, or he was a patsy or whatever. And he just keeps talking and talking and talking. Apparently he talked for 4+ hours.
Oh, goodness.
And they're driving around. They have a spot on the road with a big X that's been painted there for the spot where JFK was when he was shot.
Wow.
And it's just there, and it's on the road that you can drive through. So it's interesting. And I thought it was funny. It drives them through, but then also they get out of the car and they go and they talk and they walk around and they see this thing, comes back to the car. It had a boot on it because he was parked too long. And he had to pay an extra $105 to get the boot off his car. Then there's the second tour, which is with Ricardo. And that is a VR tour. So that one's totally virtual reality. And you actually see, and they go through some recording to add some stuff to it. So they have an actor playing Lee Harvey Oswald, and they go to his house, or maybe it was the place just that he fled to. I didn't fully understand that. And they shoot a scene there. And then they cut back to Robin, the first guy. Apparently his day job is that he's a funeral home owner or worker. So then they got to see him there, and he just keeps talking. Apparently his house is modeled after the White House.
I'm so happy for him.
Yep.
Baby.
Okay. Yep. And then they get to meet his wife. And then we go back to Ricardo, and they do a night tour that's in these buggies that are kind of like golf carts, but they're extra big. So they seat more people. And they go around, they're playing lots of music. And then there's an actress who's dressed as Jackie Kennedy, and she sits with them and just looks sad the whole time.
Well, I mean, if her husband was shot,
Well, yes, exactly. But like, that's all she does. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't interact. It's very, very weird. And so
Interesting.
that was that one. That was significantly less dark.
Yeah. Just more like history stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Then we went to New Orleans and they went on vampire tours. So first they stop off with Maven and he makes fangs for people. Like
He makes fangs.
Yep, the little like teeth caps that you can put over your teeth so that you can have fangs. He custom makes them.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
So we did that. Then he went and attended a vampire wedding during which they do actually drink human blood.
Ew, no.
Uh-huh.
No, thank you.
I agree. Then he goes to the home of a vampire and they're having a birthday party. And it's a vampire family, but it's not necessarily all hereditary family. It's people who have decided to be a family.
Okay.
And I think they're all adults. They're varying ages, but they're all adults and they're celebrating a birthday. Most of them look like pretty normal. There's one who is dressed kind of like a Beethoven style, like white wig, kind of more old school, but there's only one. And that's just, I guess, his style that he likes. And then they do a ritual at the door to ward off evil spirits where he takes some alcohol and he like sprays it out of his mouth at the door and he says things and he like waves at the door. That's, I think, where it connects a little bit to voodoo a little bit more.
Okay.
And then...
Oh no, I'm scared.
So do you remember the second show that we watched as a part of this?
No reservations.
No reservations. And do you remember that the one that you and I both watched together where they went to Helsinki?
Yes.
And do you remember how they went to a sauna?
And the cupping?
And the cupping. Do you remember the wet cupping?
Uh-huh, with the blood. Where they stabbed his back, essentially.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
I got a reprise of that.
Oh, no.
Except there was no cup.
Oh.
They so there's two guys and one of them takes his shirt off and turns around. The other guy takes a little implement, I don't know, a knife or something, and cuts into his back.
Oh.
And then he drinks his blood.
Ew. No, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, all of that is what I pictured with this show.
Me too. And that's what I got. And then this guy, he believes that he's actually a vampire and that he needs that blood to survive. And he describes how he tried all these other treatments and things and it just didn't work. But drinking somebody else's blood actually makes him feel better. And then the final statement that I wrote at the end of this episode was, gross. I do not like this show.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like literally there were I was turning my face away from the screen and I was like, oh, I did not enjoy this episode at all. Not at all. It was not pleasant.
So Ryan.
So Cheryl.
Do you feel like this matches your experience in the location of the United States?
Thankfully, no.
Good. I mean, I would be concerned if it did.
Yeah. No. It thankfully did not. This is not what my United States experiences have been.
Good. Okay. I feel safe right now then. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Ryan, I'm happy that that's not the episode you ended on. Yes, although I'm guessing you felt pretty apprehensive for the episode that we watched together.
I did, because I had just watched this and I don't remember now, but I think I actually had to shut it off because typically I'll watch the two episodes back to back, just so that I can get, just a sense one right after the other. And I'm looking for the same sorts of things. I'm pretty sure that I shut it off and then had to go up and walk and go somewhere else and be like, no, I don't want to watch any more of this show. Okay. But there's one more episode I have to watch.
Okay. Well, let's do that for the listeners then too.
But thankfully the second one was not as bad.
And it was really interesting.
I actually really, I mean, you've already alluded to this, but there was a fair amount of stuff related to radioactivity and nuclear stuff again, which is a whole science component, which I found really fascinating.
Hmm. I found the last segment really fascinating. And so I'm
Oh,
excited to talk about that.
yes. Yeah.
So the episode we watched together was episode 4 called
Mhm.
The Stands.
Which I just thought was a funny name.
And we chose it because as we've been doing these shows, we're trying to choose episodes about places that we know kind of just nothing about.
Yep.
And just as a way to broaden our knowledge of the world.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
that was a little scarier with this show, I think. I mean, no matter what, it was kind of like,
Yeah.
who knows what we're getting into
Yeah.
with this show. But it was like, I don't know what's happening in the stands that we're going to be talking about. Like,
Yep.
I wouldn't have the first guess.
Yep. And so the stands that it's referring to are Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. And was there one more? I feel like I'm missing one. I thought there was a third one. No? Just those two?
Those were the 2 that I wrote down. He talks
Okay.
about how there's 5 countries called the stands, and I think he visits 2
Yep.
of them, maybe a third one.
Yeah, that's because I only have the 2 written down.
Yeah.
But in my head, I thought he went to 3. But he went to a couple of different places in Kazakhstan.
Yes. So he talks about how Kazakhstan is, I think he says, the most bombed place on Earth.
Yeah, he did. He said one of the most nuclear bombed places in the world. And I think what he means by that is not that it was bombed in that, like in war, but they set off a lot of nuclear bombs
Yeah.
there because it was a testing site.
Yeah, and so it just seems like it's just had the most bombs set off there. Yeah, you're
Yep.
right. Not like
Yep.
the country that's been bombed the most or something like that.
Right.
But
Yeah,
literally-
he talked about how it was the 9th largest country in the world, which I didn't realize.
Yeah,
It's
I
very
didn't know that
big.
either. I would have never guessed that. So that was
Yeah.
interesting.
And then they talk about the Polygon, which is a region of the USSR where the nuclear test site was.
And then they visit.
And they do. And they meet up with Andy, or he
Mm-hmm.
meets up with Andy, I guess.
Andy likes to holiday in combat zones and has for the last
Yeah.
30 years.
Yeah.
And so that was interesting because Andy seems fairly normal, I think.
Uh-huh. Yes.
And kind of just seemed like he reminded me of just like a teenage boy almost with his fascination of, or like entertainment that he got from visiting.
But he was definitely not a teenage boy.
Yes.
He was middle-aged
full grown
for sure.
man.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, he travels to war zones. I did think maybe I shouldn't have thought it was funny, but I did find it funny that there was a name for the first bomb that was detonated there. Did you catch it?
No.
Joe 1, named after Joseph Stalin.
Oh man. So they go to a lake. Do they call it Bomb Lake? I forget what they call the lake.
Atomic Lake.
Atomic
I'm
Lake.
just going to mention before this, they get to a hotel and Andy makes a comment that I just thought was funny. So I wrote it down. He said, I didn't exactly expect the Ritz, but I didn't expect the Bates Motel either.
Oh yeah.
Because they walk down this creepy hallway
Yeah.
into their hotel.
With tiny
was funny.
beds and
Yeah.
stains on
And
the
did you-
sheets.
Did you notice that Andy had a printed binder of all of his research?
Yes. Yeah. So that was
Which
really
was
interesting. And he had really done his research.
Yeah. Yeah. So then you're right. They go to this atomic lake where apparently it was created in 1965 by an underground nuclear explosion. It's 400 meters wide and 100 meters deep. And they said that the water is 100 times more radioactive than drinking water.
Oh boy.
But again, that doesn't necessarily tell you exactly how radioactive it is because drinking water isn't really radioactive,
Yeah.
right? And so 100 times more, that doesn't automatically make it dangerous. It sounds scary,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's this terrible thing. I mean, and there were people there who were fishing.
That was crazy. And then they eat the fish.
They do. And and the host and Andy eat the fish too.
Yeah, and they're apprehensive, and then also they're like, I don't know, I guess we're hungry, so we're gonna eat. Which
Yeah.
I mean, I think they also eat it for the show, but
Oh, for sure they do.
Yeah.
Well, and then I thought it was interesting, and this is where I had to do a little research. The locals who were there and that gave them the fish said that they needed to drink vodka because that counteracted the radiation.
yeah, that was
And
an
so
interesting idea.
I had to research that because
I'm sure you did.
Yeah. And the basic answer is no, it doesn't really work. There are some ideas around it that it sort of kind of does. And there were a couple of components where there are a few things that vodka can do, but for the most part, the way it ends up working out inside your body, no, it wouldn't actually be successful.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's probably just like a nice excuse to drink. And they swim,
So yeah, they do. They swim along the surface of the lake.
and someone tells them you can swim, and that's fine, but maybe don't dive deep.
Yep. Because the deeper you go, the stronger the radiation is.
Yeah.
The thing that I found myself thinking about was I wonder which type of radiation. And if I knew a little bit more about nuclear chemistry, I might be able to, maybe I should have just known. But because there's different types of radiation. So there's alpha particles, beta particles, gamma rays, which are the worst, which wouldn't still be there. And then there's neutron radiation. And if the radiation is neutron radiation, then them eating fish would actually be really dangerous.
Oh,
Because,
interesting.
yeah, alpha particles can be stopped by a piece of paper. And then the beta particles, you need something a little bit thicker, but clothing is usually thick enough. But the neutron radiation and gamma rays are the ones that are super
Interesting.
dangerous. So I don't know, but they swam.
They swam. And then they go to a field where they said it was the first atomic detonation, and then there were many detonations there.
Yeah.
And they wear paper suits and face masks, and he's
Mhm.
wondering if the paper suits are enough to
And
stop
right.
it.
And that's where I'm saying,
Yeah.
depending on the type of radiation, it actually could be,
Interesting.
right?
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, because we can't see it, because it's so tiny, we don't have a way of understanding.
Yeah. Well, and if it's not like the air smells different, or something like
Right.
that, then
Right.
that's really tough too.
Yep.
So they also have a Geiger counter. So I
They
got
do.
2 episodes where we talked about Geiger counters.
I know, I'm so jealous
And
because I got blood drinking and you got
and
Geiger counters.
this one went up to 14.
It did.
So I knew that was very high because of my Japan episode.
Right.
And so that was interesting.
But it also depends, again, on what the units are. Because there's more than one unit that you can use. And that's I was trying to dive in. And I think, based on what I can find, millisieverts is probably what the unit was that they were using. And just to give you a reference, because I dug in with the internet quite a bit here because this is what I do. To give you an idea, so at 15 millisieverts, that's about the amount of radiation you would get from a CT scan of your abdomen and pelvis.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So just
so like you're saying, if you're living in that would be dangerous.
right,
Just like
but a
you've
one-time
lived in a
deal.
CT scan.
Exactly. But it's kind of like, it's a little bit different, but kind of like x-rays. I don't know if you noticed that when either you go to the doctor or the dentist and they take an x-ray, usually the radiologist, the person or the tech who's running it, they leave the room.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. You put on the lead vest or whatever, but they leave the room.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, wait, but why is it safe for me to be in here? Because you're just getting the one x-ray.
But
They're
that's
in
their
there
job.
every single day.
Mhm.
And so they would be exposed over and over and over again. And that could be toxic for them because that's what they do all the time.
That makes sense.
So yeah, it's a similar thing.
So then they ask a tour guide if there are health problems in the area
Uh-huh.
and get very vague answers.
Yeah. Yeah, what I
And
wrote was the guide seems reluctant to admit that the tests led to any medical issues.
yeah. So then they ask some medical people about
Hmm.
it, and they're more honest about
Yeah,
it. And
yeah.
I think they're the ones that say, well, you should go to an orphanage.
Hmm.
And so they meet these kids, and like one of them is paralyzed.
Hmm.
Um, and
And
you
these are
can,
young kids.
yeah, young kids, and you can visually tell that they're having some sorts of growth defects or different things
Hmm.
like that. And Andy, who thought it was funny to eat the fish and swim in the water,
Yep.
is really impacted
Yeah.
by this, and he feels some guilt for laughing about it or kind of blowing it off as just a kind of thing that got his adrenaline rushing before.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting.
Yeah. It was very sad.
Yeah. So then we go to a closed city that is pretty exclusive to get into. I think it's called Bilanur. Is that what he said? Bilanur?
What I wrote down was Baikonur. Baikonur.
Okay.
Yeah. Baikonour is what
And
I
the
have written
only
down.
note I took was the word rocket, because then I figured that you would talk
That I
about
would do the rest.
the rocket more.
Yeah, I was super fascinated by this for sure. This apparently was the heart of the Russian space race. This is where Yuri Gagarin, who was the first human out in space to orbit the Earth, he launched from there. It, like you said, it's still a closed city, so you can't just go if you wanted to. Apparently, even though it's in Kazakhstan, it's still leased by the Russians. So
Oh.
Russia still is leasing the land and the facilities so that they can continue to run their cosmonaut program from there,
Wow.
which I thought was very interesting. And they talked about the Soyuz rocket, and they didn't directly say it, but it made me think this may be the spot where Russia is still currently launching. And so just a little while ago, we had the SpaceX rocket launch US astronauts for the first time in 9 years since we stopped the space shuttle program.
Hmm.
And so in order for us to get to and from the International Space Station, we've had to use Russia's program, which means we've probably been launching from there.
Hmm. Well,
I guess
and
I
they
assumed it was
showed
in
American
Russia.
astronauts there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It
So-
was very interesting.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
The host of the show was concerned about them using a 50-year-old rocket, and he mentioned it a couple times.
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I'm not a rocket scientist. So
Oh,
I
okay.
know, surprise.
Got it.
So I'm definitely not an expert. I was not as concerned as he was.
Hmm.
He seemed really, really concerned, and he thought that it was all really sketchy. And I think he also was, I don't really see what the big deal is, because apparently it's only really wealthy tourists who pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to go and watch a rocket launch. And he's like, I don't understand. What's the big deal? Right.
Yeah.
And the train pulls the rocket out. They had a museum of the cosmonaut program. They do a press conference, all these different things. And then at the end, he actually does get to see a launch. And he talks about how, oh yeah, now I get it. I see why you would travel this far to be able to see a
Yeah.
rocket launch. And I would love to go do that. I'd love to see a rocket launch. And I think especially our generation, Cheryl, because we didn't really grow up with the space program in the same way.
Yeah.
The space shuttle was running, and I always get the two mixed up. The Challenger and the Columbia were the two space shuttles that blew up, that exploded. I
Mhm.
believe the Challenger was the one that blew up on takeoff. And I think that I want to say like 1986 or something. So I was alive, but I don't remember it.
Yeah.
And then I do remember the Columbia because that was on reentry.
Okay.
But those are the only major space accidents that I can think of in my memory. But you look at the U.S. space program, there were a lot of accidents that happened because it's super dangerous stuff. So, the fact that he's like, oh, 50-year-old rocket, I don't know that it's any less safe than a current rocket. It's rocket travel is just dangerous. And so, 50 years, sure. I guess maybe it's less likely to be, to have current technology, but really the technology is not so much about the actual rocket itself and more about the computers and all of that sort of stuff. But the actual physics that gets you up into space, I don't think has changed in 50 years.
Yeah, I would assume they've had modern day computers on there and just the actual like hardware or like equipment is the old stuff.
Yeah, and I don't know.
The part I liked was he got to go to a press conference where they interviewed the astronauts. And what was funny to me was he's explaining to us that he's out of his element and doesn't know what he's talking about. Right. But it's his turn to ask a question,
or something. Yeah.
Which I didn't really believe, but that's okay. Because it was like he could also choose to not ask a question.
He may have meant that he had asked to ask a question and he finally got the microphone.
Yeah,
and
maybe something like that.
It was his turn, maybe. Yeah.
And so he felt like he was asking a really dumb question of like, why do you even care? Like we've already gone to space, so like why would you care about this? And so it was funny to me though, because the people answering the questions weren't aware that his show is very different than these other people who are interviewing them for the news or things like that. Right. So that was funny to me that like they wouldn't even think twice of a camera being there showing him asking that question or anything. It was just like a different dynamic than maybe typically you get where there's like that's the only camera there and something's going on, So yeah, so that was kind of funny to me. But
well, I actually appreciated his question and the response because like you said, the question was something like, hey, we've already been there. It's not so much the first person there anymore. We send, rockets up all the time. Why do we go? Like, what's the point? And he tried to be as respectful as possible.
Yes.
I think in the way that he was asking it. And if I remember, I think it was one of the cosmonauts that answered. And I think we got a translation.
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
And what I really thought that his answer was really good because he said, no, I don't think that's a dumb question at all. I think that's a really important question. Why are we going up? And he launches into all of the reasons that, of course, now off the top of my head, I can't remember what he said, but but I thought they were really good. And I think it's a valid question because it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to send people into space. We should be asking, is this worth it?
Yeah.
That is the right question to ask.
Yeah. So that was cool.
Yeah.
That was a total surprise with this episode. I was not expecting that aspect of that. And so that was really cool.
Yeah.
And pretty exclusive to be able to see that.
Yeah.
So that was neat.
Unless you have, hundreds of thousands of dollars to do the tour yourself. If any of our listeners would like to fund us, we would be happy to do a live episode from the launch of a Soyuz rocket.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yep.
No, we'd be happy to. Yeah. Bonus content for sure.
Exactly. Yep.
We'll even put out 2 episodes that week.
I'll bet we could do that.
So then we finish this episode in Turkmenistan.
Yeah.
At the Martial Arts Games, I believe.
Yes. Well, I wrote it. Where did I write it down? The Asian Indoor and Martial Arts Games.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was bonkers.
First of all, I didn't know anything about Turkmenistan. I knew nothing about it.
It sounds a little fake. It sounds like you're trying to make Turkey one of the stands.
Yep.
And so it was interesting because, I went in totally blind as well.
Yeah.
And so we learned really quickly that there is a dictator in this country.
Apparently it's considered a kingdom. and he described it as Las Vegas meets North Korea.
Yeah, that's a good description.
Yeah.
It was, I don't know what I did picture if you just said this country has a dictator, but I did not picture this. So it was really
Yeah.
so interesting. And so he was able to go into this country as a sports reporter from New
Yep.
Zealand.
For the Asian Indoor and Martial Arts Games.
And he was one of the very few reporters there.
Yeah. He got there, I think technically it was a day before stuff had opened or whatever. And they show him in the press box area, and he
Alone.
was the only one.
Yeah.
Nobody else was there.
Yeah.
And,
yeah. And so it's similar to the Olympics as far as how much they get into it. I'm trying to think of even the right word to describe
and so
that.
they said that it cost $5 billion to build all of the special buildings, just like they do with the Olympics. They build special facilities and all this stuff, and they spent $5 billion, which is more than the Rio Olympics spent. They said.
And no one's there.
No one is there. The city is gorgeous. It's white. Oh, I don't remember what the type of stone.
White marble.
Maybe it was marble, right? And all of these buildings, and they are beautiful, and there are no people.
It's so creepy. This was creepier to me than this abandoned city island in Japan, because this is like all the stuff was just built and supposed to be enjoyed, you would think, and no one's there.
No.
Like hardly any cars on the road.
Yeah.
It was so weird.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he wants to go to a fiery pit that's been burning for 40 years. Can you explain
that sounded really
what this
cool.
was?
It was called the Gates of Hell. And it was a pit. I don't think that they did a great job of explaining it. Somehow it's a pit of oil that started burning and is still burning. And so he and his guide, who was a Russian named Aziz, wanted to go. And I guess they had this whole thing where they were going to try and, I think, cook eggs on it, right? Because it's down this pit. They get this big, long metal pole with like not a plate, but like a dish type of a thing on the end.
In their hotel room.
Yeah. And they were going to like, move it down there so that they could cook it on the fires that are just still burning and then bring it up. But Cheryl, they don't get to go.
No, they don't.
Why not?
They're just not allowed. Like,
so
legally,
apparently
the
president closed off everything outside of the city, and journalists were not allowed to leave the city.
Which, that's not questionable at all or concerning.
Yeah.
Ooh. Yeah. So they can't go to this fiery pit. So instead they go on a tour of the inner city.
Yep.
And we find out that they're not allowed to film locals. So we can hear their tour guide's voice in the car they're in.
Yep.
But they can't film any
They can't
locals.
film his face.
Yeah.
We get this kind of profile silhouette from like behind the car seat, but we don't actually see any details in the face at all.
Yeah. And so we learned some fun things about this city. That apparently the president is really into Guinness records. And so there's 3 we hear about. And the first one had to do with marble. It was like the largest cluster of white marble buildings or something very specific. The largest indoor Ferris wheel, which we get a shot of, and it looks like you just like covered up a Ferris wheel.
Yep. I mean, it's big. It's kind of like a London Eye type of a Ferris
and then
wheel.
The largest image of a star, maybe something about a star.
Something, yeah. I don't know.
And no one's there. This city, like the architecture and everything, is so over the top. Golden statue of the president on an iceberg riding a horse. And I mean, just all this stuff, and no one is there.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And I don't know if that's the way it always is, or just because of these games.
Yeah, they don't explain why. I don't think they know
I don't think
why.
they know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it gets weirder
Uh-huh.
because he, in the middle of the night, apparently leaned on a mirror in his hotel room and got a big cut on his hand.
I got more blood. Lucky me.
Oh yeah. And so he goes to the hospital and he's really worried about missing the opening of the games.
Because the president's going to be there. Because he really wanted to be able to see the president.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
maybe interview him, he was hoping.
Yeah. And so they inject him with a horse tranquilizer after
I
giving him
didn't
stitches,
fully
or
understand.
it
I
was
don't
really
know.
hard to tell. At least he gets some sort of a bandage,
Yeah.
and then they just like send him on his way.
Yep.
And so he's high and goes to the opening ceremonies.
I don't know if high, but he's drugged up for sure.
Yes. Yeah. And the opening ceremonies are more extravagant than Rio. So once again, it's like bigger
Yep.
than Rio's Olympics.
I wrote down that it was a 3-hour long opening ceremony.
Yeah, with like all sorts of performances, people flying with like sparkler things,
Yeah.
shooting. I mean, all
We only
sorts
saw
of
bits and
things.
pieces of it, but it looked there were horses involved and hundreds of people and lights and fireworks, and
Yeah,
it was,
over the top.
I mean, a lot of the opening ceremonies anymore
Yeah.
are pretty over the top,
But it was
but I
like
don't think they
above
go on
that.
for 3 hours.
Yeah, yeah. And it was more expensive than Rio. That's what they said.
Yep.
So
Yep.
and then he sees the president give a speech.
Yep.
So we get that, and then it ends with his friend sends him a video of cooking eggs over the fiery pit because
Apparently he snuck out of the city.
Oh, that terrified me so much. I mean, even that they're going to this country was kind of scary, and then on top of that, he like sneaks out to go do that was crazy. But
Yeah. I think we should say that at the opening ceremonies, the stands were full. There were lots and lots of people there.
there's a couple shots of empty seats, but there's a lot of crowd noise, and there's parts of the crowd that are just packed of people.
Yeah. So there's people in the city.
Yeah, that's true.
You just never see them in the city.
Yeah. And journalists don't get to see the rest of the country.
Yeah.
So they get to see this one city.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was so interesting.
It was incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would watch that show a lot.
What do you mean?
Like if that part of the episode was what the show was like here's an aspect of a country that you've never seen before. Like that's so interesting to me because I don't always pay enough attention to current events, or things like that. And so
Sure.
I was just like, my jaw was dropping the whole time during that part of the episode. So it was really interesting.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the episode. Like I said at the beginning of our episode, I feel like I had two very different experiences in the two episodes that I watched, because the one, I did not like it. It was exactly like I was afraid the show was going to be.
Yeah.
And I was not interested. But the one on the stands was so fascinating for me. 2/3 of it was stuff that I'm already into. It was science-y and space and nuclear physics, which I am incredibly fascinated by. So that in and of itself, I found interesting just because of the places that he went. And then, Turkmenistan, like you said, we try and pick places that we don't know very much about. I definitely didn't know this.
Yeah.
And I'd never seen a picture. I didn't know anything about it. And I still wouldn't say that I know very much, but I definitely know a lot more now than I did before.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really interesting. I still found the show, and maybe it says narration. He was kind of boring, but I think some of the content they showed was really interesting.
See, he didn't bore me.
But I think part of that is it depends on maybe how I approach these because I think you can call a lot of things entertainment, and I think I don't think he was entertaining, but I think
Right.
it was interesting And so,
Oh, see, I find that yeah, because for the most part, I'm not watching the travel show to be entertained. I'm watching it to gain knowledge about a place. And
yeah,
so I wasn't looking or expecting entertainment,
yeah,
which actually I think is partly why Travel Man was one that I enjoyed so much more, was because it was also incredibly entertaining.
yes. But here's the thing: is I forget the name of the host of Travel Man.
Richard Ayoade.
I want him to host this show. I want more reactions. This
Because then you
show,
get the
I think it's
snarky
supposed to kind
remarks.
of like, I mean, it's about dark tourism. I want
Yeah.
some opinions on it. And he gives his opinions in such this dry, monotone way. I want
Like you said,
reactions.
he's a journalist. I think he's
Yes.
intentionally trying to remove and just report.
Yes. Yeah. And I think I want someone who's like, are you kidding me? You know, like I want a little more of like a personality
Yeah.
hosting a show about dark tourism.
Yeah.
Or I want a dark tourist to host it who loves this. Although I wouldn't watch that show. But I would watch
No, you would not.
Travel Man guy, Richard. I would watch him host the show a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't know, he might have gotten kicked out of that country. Because they talk about,
yeah,
like, don't say
probably.
anything negative about the president and your room might be bugged and all those things. So
Yeah.
who knows?
Oh, that's right. I forgot. He did. David, the host, did actually search his room for bugs.
Yeah.
Didn't
Yeah.
find any, but
That was where he was being very funny. He made really funny comments while he did that. I enjoyed that. Okay, so Ryan,
Cheryl.
based on the title of our show, Take Me
Yeah.
With You, if you
Mhm.
could take yourself to just one thing from this episode, what would it be and why?
Oh, probably the rocket launch. I think there's a lot that I would be really interested in, but the rocket launch, I think, partly just because it's so expensive,
Yeah,
I
that'd be
would
like
never
a once in a
be able-
lifetime.
I would never be able to do that. I mean, I probably wouldn't be able to go to Turkmenistan either, but that's
Yeah.
also a little bit scarier for me to me. So I think I would do the rocket launch because I would enjoy seeing the rocket launch. It would be cool to see the Cosmonaut Museum, to see a space program that isn't the US space program. I find
Mm.
that incredibly interesting to see a different cultural perspective on a similar idea or theme.
Mm.
That's always really interesting, I think. So, yeah, I think that's what I would do. What about you?
If we could teleport, then I would want to go to Turkmenistan.
Yeah.
Because if I could get over my fear of getting in trouble there or imprisoned
Yeah.
or, you know, like, I don't think I would actually want to go there because I'd be so terrified of
Right.
the government and something happening to me. But, like, I would love to see either that city or just the opening ceremonies would
Yeah.
be really interesting
Yeah.
to see. I think it would be so crazy to just stand in that city and just have it be empty and also like the most extravagant thing you've
Mhm.
ever seen.
Yeah.
Would be very interesting.
Yeah.
So did this episode make you want to go to the stands more than before watching this episode?
Yeah. It definitely did.
Mm,
Because again, I didn't know very much about the stands and there's some cool things. The one component that I would say, if this is considered dark tourism, and I never would have put it in that category,
Mm.
but the component that I would be a dark tourist would be these nuclear fallout sites.
mm,
You know, even going to Fukushima, I would totally do that
really?
tour. Oh yeah, I would find that incredibly fascinating. If I had a chance to go to Chernobyl, I would go to Chernobyl.
Hmm.
I would do some of those things. I think because the science behind it is something that's so fascinating to me. And so knowing that you could take precautions, I wouldn't just go wherever,
Yeah.
but I've done some of my own research a little bit on nuclear radiation. I've seen some other programs. There's a really interesting program on PBS called Twisting the Dragon's Tail, where one of the YouTubers that I enjoy kind of hosts this thing about kind of radiation and what does it mean and how does it work. And he actually does get to go to Chernobyl and with a Geiger counter and see these different things and stuff. So I'm somewhat familiar with that kind of idea already. And I would really enjoy being able to just see what that's actually like in person. And that, I guess, in that component of me, I am a little bit of a dark tourist. But I would not want to go to any of the sites in the first episode that I watched. None. Zero. Zip. Zilch. Blah. No, thank you. How about you? Would you like to go to any of, I mean, you already talked about Turkmenistan, but do you think it made you want to go more than before?
No.
Okay.
I don't. I say I want to go everywhere, and then I
But
watched
maybe that's not true.
this episode, and I was like, I think I'm good. Yeah. No interest there, really. Okay, so based on this show overall, would you want to travel with David Farrier?
I don't think I would mind traveling with him as much as you would. I think the part, this is going to sound really terrible. I think the part that I might like to travel with him with would be because he is a journalist. He can get into places and see things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to see or do. And that for that component, I think I would appreciate traveling with him. I mean, I don't think he would bother me at all or anything like that. But if it's just to these dark tourist sites, I'm definitely not interested in a lot of them. So
Yeah.
how about you? I know he's not your favorite person.
I think I can kind of relate to that answer. I mean, he seems fine as a person. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know if he should host a TV show or not, but yeah, he seemed like a perfectly normal person.
I will say one of the things I do appreciate about the show, though, is it's not over the top, over dramatic.
Yes.
Because I think you could swing too far the other way and totally make everything extra creepy and extra weird and all of those and just emphasize those things. And I appreciate that it doesn't do that. Because I've definitely, you know, like I think I've talked about this before, kind of the History Channel type thing from the early 2000s where everything was over the top and it was the end of the world and the apocalypse this and black holes are going to destroy everything and, you know, all this stuff. And it's like, well, okay, it's interesting enough. You don't need to sensationalize it. So I do appreciate that they didn't sensationalize it. But I can see where you're coming from, that maybe a little bit more oomph and energy in the show might help it.
Yeah. And would you recommend this show?
That's a tough one. I think it depends on the person.
Yeah.
You know, for example, a friend of mine who is a good friend of mine who listens to this show, and I can pretty much guarantee you is listening to this episode. And I really hope that she skipped over the part when I recommended it. I would not recommend the show to her. My friend Ingrid, I would not. She was... Ingrid and Dawn were both on the episode where I recorded information before going to Disneyland.
Yeah.
I just kind of took the mic and they kind of gave me tips. So I would not recommend it for her. It's not her type of show. She gets too emotionally connected to whatever's happening. And I think that would just be too much for her. I'm not sure I would watch another episode just because, yes, the stands were interesting, but the other episode that I watched was so disturbing and it bothered me so much. I don't know that I'm willing to roll the dice on another episode. So I think it really depends on if that sort of stuff bothers you or not. And if it doesn't, then there's some really interesting things that the show does that I haven't seen in other travel shows.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a very different angle. I would say if you like murder podcasts, you might like it. I don't know. It depends on if you consider yourself a dark tourist or if you're just fascinated by some of those ideas, then it's a pretty interesting show. Yeah. I agree. I won't watch more of it because I don't want to see a lot of blood stuff. Yeah.
You could watch the episode I watched. You'd really like it.
No, thank you. I'm good.
No. And I don't even want to have watched the episode that I watched. That's going to do it for this week's episode. We would love it if you would follow us on social media. We are at TMWY Podcast. That's TMWY for Take Me With You Podcast. We are on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter.
You can also email us at timweedpodcast@gmail.com. Send us suggestions of shows we should watch, guests we should have on. Let's see, maybe tell us about a time when you cooked an omelet over a giant fiery pit.
I think that's a pretty common experience. So I expect to hear from every one of our listeners about the time that you did that. You can also call us and leave us a voicemail at 406-763-8699. Another way to remember that is 406-POD-TIMWE. We would really appreciate it if you would rate and review our podcast. If you would share about this episode on social media, especially if you know people who either are dark tourists or who you think might be interested. Share this episode so they can find out more about the show. And we'd love it if you would subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode.
As always, thank you to Beth Reed Miller for the use of her awesome artwork. You can check out more of Beth's artwork at Beth Is Something. And thank you to Erica Corbin for the use of her song Round the Globe. You can listen to Erica's music wherever music is sold or streamed.
I don't know about you, Cheryl, but I'm going to go do some not dark things now.
I'm going to go watch a comedy or something.
Well, until next time, remember to take me with you.
Take me with you.
Can we get a sailboat chasing down the sunset as we float round and round the globe? Salty air and balmy nights, guided only by the lights above, and a little love. Oh, the world is out there waiting to explore, and all our troubles here wanting to be